live. By live, I mean we are pre-recording this. Thank you guys for tuning in. On the line with us today, we've got Conor Macfarlane, who's the CEO of 3i Technologies, my boss, as well as the wonderful John Barrett from Humanergy, who's got a brand new book that we're going to talk about in just a second. But before we jump into there and introduce Conor, John, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are, your organization, Humanergy, and also your newest book that you have coming out?
Well, thank you. Appreciate it, Reid. So my name is John Barrett. I'm principal and co-owner at the organization called Humanergy. Humanergy is what we call a boutique, which I think is a fancy way of saying small leadership, organizational, teamwork, communication, coaching and consulting group. We're based in the Midwest of the US, and we've been in business for just over 20 years. We get the opportunity to work with wonderful people from all walks of life, the largest organizations down to local organizations, and most of all the sectors of the economy. And our speciality is really to help people thrive in the workplace individually, as part of a team, and as part of an organization, to do something special, and at the end of the day, hopefully to make the world a better place.
Awesome, and thank you. And I have one of your books here that we're going to discuss in the podcast, the 50 Do's for Everyday Leadership. But you also have a new book coming out as well. Can you just real quick give us a little snapshot of that and tell us a little bit about that book?
Sure. Right. Well, I noticed you flashed that one up. So here's the new book.
Awesome. There it is.
There it is. These are actually hot off the press. So both books were really distilled from our experience in doing the work that we do. The 50 Do's was literally was born out of doing focus groups with several hundred frontline supervisors and distilling that out, and then over a period of about 10 years, doing follow-on work with leaders in organizations, sort of pulling that together, and that became the 50 Do's. Now, what great teams do great is a similar experience. We work with teams all the time. We engage with them, helping them to be the best that they can be, to resolve their issues, and to grow and strengthen and to deliver. And as we've done that, we've learned repeatedly that there is some real magic to teamwork. It isn't complicated. It's really, as the tagline says, how ordinary people can really accomplish the extraordinary. And we're super, super excited to pull this together and to get it out into the world. And we can't wait for people to get a chance to read it, and more importantly, to use it in their lives.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. And then Conor, over to you, sir.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be on the pre-release group for that book. So I would just echo what Reid and John have said. It's wonderful distillation of a lot of the great stuff that Humanergy's done. I've had the good fortune of knowing and working with John for the better part of 10 years. And he's one of my favorite people to talk to. I'm excited to be here with him today, and you as well, Reid, and get to listen to some words of wisdom from John. It's always funny because I think of great listeners, and John's at the top of the list, and our goal today is going to try to get him to talk instead of just listen. So hopefully we can do that. And I guess I can kick us off with just talking about, I talked to John the other week, and this is certainly a time where we're all sensitive to teamwork and collaboration, and how do we do it? We're in a crazy world, but felt like the blueprint for the way that we operate and have historically made decisions all of a sudden isn't relevant anymore. And maybe that's a good point to just jump right in and hear from John. What do you say to people who are dealing with the rapid change that's happening today?
I think where I would want to start is, when I work with people, it's not so much about telling them about things, it's really engaging them in a conversation. Because if you're a business owner, or you're out there making sales or selling, consulting, or whatever it is that you're doing, you've got a brain and you've worked out how to be successful. So really, it's a conversation to unlock people's thinking, because we can all get stuck. And typically we get stuck in what we know and what we love in the history of our experiences. And in this time of unprecedented change, we're really talking about going into somewhat uncharted territory, and we need to upgrade our thinking to match the challenge. And so I'm going to reference a quote from Wayne Gretzky, which is, you got to skate to where the puck is going. And that was how he was so amazing. And the question is, we can see where the puck is today. Where's the puck going to go in the future? And so the conversation I engage with people is really, what do we know about where the puck is going, how fast it is going? So it's really, what's the rate of change? How smooth is the change? How much do we know about the direction it's going? Right? Do we understand why the change is happening? And do we know, what's the level of impact of this change? Now, today, we're talking about exponential. We're talking about volatile. We're talking about uncertainty. We're talking about ambiguity. And we're talking about existential, meaning, if we don't get this right, we may not be around as an organization to deal with this. And so that's where I start, really, is to get people's heads wrapped around the nature of the reality that we're all trying to work through. And then they can engage their brains. And it turns out that, from there, we're able to generate some solutions and paths forward that have, a good probability of being successful.
It's interesting. So you said something about exponential. And I think the feeling that a lot of us have is this change is coming very rapidly. It probably just puts a spotlight on how do we manage change. If we want to dig in a little bit on that, what kind of things do you try to suggest when you're talking to folks about just change management in general?
Yeah. So I want to pick up on the exponential, because I think that is probably one of the key things. It's one thing to skate where the puck is going, and you can sort of see how fast the puck is going, and you can extrapolate, okay, that's how fast the puck is going. Therefore, it'll be here in a certain period of time. But when we talk about exponential, it's really skate to where the puck is accelerating. And so we have to engage in a whole different thought process as to, taking what we've seen and then multiplying it by multiple factors, and then imagine that future reality, and then make what seems today some extraordinary responses. So I would argue that, what we're facing today was broadly predictable. We know the basics of the rate of change for the most part, and people knew it was going to be exponential. And the thing is that we didn't start dealing with it early enough. So the first thing is, proactive urgency, meaning we got to get urgent before we feel like we need to. We have to pull the alarm bell now, even though the sun is shining and everything looks great. Because what we can see coming towards us is that, it's rapidly and increasingly rapidly going to get out of control. So that's a big thing. I think the other thing that I would offer in terms of dealing with change management at a business level is you don't have the luxury of indulging yourself in your own biases and wishful thinking. And so this is the time that you have to really look hard at your assumptions, your beliefs about things, what you want to happen versus what's really happening, what are the facts, and what are the trends. And then, you really got to put your ego aside and then make those tough calls.
You said something earlier about, I think we need to be more urgent and proactive urgency with change. And I think what I was hearing was boy, it sounds like we need to get better at building resiliency into our business. What do you think about that?
Well, absolutely, because I think that's the thing is when you combine rapid change with a degree of uncertainty and ambiguity, then the type of resiliency that we need changes as well. And so what I mean by that is there's a resilience. If you said to resilience to somebody, they would think strength, right? The ability to resist, to hold strong, etc. And it turns out in this type of change, I think what you're talking about is super adaptability. That is, adaptability is your superpower when it comes to this rate of change and this unknown of change. And so that means then, how do we become adaptable? Well, we have to make sure that we have a really good radar. That is, we have to not only be looking at the news today, we have to be looking at what are the indicators for 1 month, 3 months, 12 months, what's happening out there beyond the horizon. And we have to be updating that constantly because our knowledge or our understanding is going to be constantly updating. And then, we have to be engaging in, if you like, cycles of review on a much advanced rate. So, for example, it was not unusual for most companies to be sitting down once a day to be doing updates, particularly at the height of the immediate crisis. They'd never done that before. Well, it's just because the rate of change was so rapid and the rate of updates was so rapid, that's what they had to do. So you need to have a cadence of, is it daily? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? And you need to be asking the right questions and be looking at the right data. And that's a big part of your resilience is, you're adapting and you're moving with, your knowledge. Two more things. Second one is you got to identify what's sacred. And so that can be a heart-wrenching thought and conversation, because separating out what's sacred that you have to hold on to when you're making all these changes, and then maybe killing some sacred cows that you thought were sacred, that's critical. If you change anything, you don't know who you are and you get lost. So what is essential to your identity and what's most important to you, and what are things that you're willing to sacrifice, because you know what? Times have changed. And then the last thing, Conor, I guess I would offer is the heart of your resiliency for any organization is your people. It's your people and your culture. And, some organizations do a great job of treating their people as a treasure and as the heart of the organization. Some organizations pay it lip service, but I think, everybody's realizing that you have to make an active and purposeful effort to treat people and engage with people as super valuable resources more than ever.
Yeah, because that was something that I wrote down a bunch of stuff as you're talking there. Like, there's a lot of things I want to follow up on. I think can we kind of peel the curtain back on that people part of it, because that is critical. And I think it's so easy right now. I know it's something that, I'm hypersensitive to, trying to figure out, hey, are we doing the right thing for our people? Because I'm working on how do I make sure that we are aware of the macroeconomic trends, the things we need to be staying ahead of, making sure that, solid financial modeling, all those things are in place. Yeah. We're also working through, I think, a record number of new partnerships to try to solve problems that are front and center and urgent now. So, I don't want to forget about our people. I'm sure there are many others like me who manage and lead people. Can you tell us a little bit more about, what would you say to me? What would you say to others in similar situations?
Sure. So I think I use a framework that has 5 elements when it comes to the people side of change management. Now, the first one is, because what you want, right, is you want, through this crisis, you need people to be operating at their absolute best. and they have to maintain their commitment and care for the success of the organization, even though it's a personal level they may have some concerns. And so the first thing is that you have to promote this idea of we're in it for the greater good, right? The team, the organization, the partnership, whatever. And so job number one is, as you mentioned, you're looking at the macro situation, you're looking at your P&L, you're looking at your cash flow, etc. I mean, your job as business leader is you need to work out what's the greater good, meaning, how do we best survive as a business going forward? And you need to be thinking about that, and because people have to believe that what they're striving for is that. Otherwise, they're going to bail and they're going to look out for number one. So if you're not looking out for the greater good and make that number one, other people are going to realize that and look out for their number one, which is themselves, which is then completely counterproductive. So once you've got that, then the second thing is you need to make sure that people understand the why, the what, and the how. What is the decision? Why are we making it? And how's this going to work? Because if they don't get it, there's uncertainty, there's ambiguity, they're unnecessarily unsure, they can't fight with you, right? And then the next one is you do have to pay attention to the fact is that they are human beings and there is an impact on them. And so, and that has an emotional context to it. And so the way to deal with that then is listening. And that's really paying attention and being willing to listen and hear people out. And, you don't have to necessarily solve the apprehensions and fears. That's maybe beyond, your power. But the fact that you've listened, that allows them to work through, that impact piece. They have to trust you. Right, so more than ever, your word has to be your bond. Right, if you say that you're going to get back with people and give them an update, then absolutely have to do that on the small things as well as on the big things. And then lastly, as you make a decision about a strategy going forward or a new way of looking at things, the worst thing that leaders can do is to lump that on top of everything else and say, hey, work it out. So you have to make sure that people are set up for success so that they feel like they have the resources, the priorities in order to enable them to win. So all those things are what I would call substantive and not superficial. It doesn't mean you don't have coffee hour and things like that. But in my experience, right, the things that really make a difference and really keep people together and really are taking care of people, taking care of the substantial things that, I wouldn't say life or death's too dramatic, but that are real.
Yeah.
Then you can have your coffee hours and your t-shirts.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's fantastic. You said something earlier too that I want to touch back on about the, our ability to kind of evolve and adapt and in these times. And we're fortunate because we're relatively small on the scale. So one of the things that I think has been great and a lot of people love about working at 3i, and I'm sure others in smaller organizations, and there's countless large organizations that do it well too, but that ability to still maintain some sense of nimbleness. And I think that that's one of the things that a lot of folks, when they come here, they talk about, wow, it's great. If we have a good idea or something that's impactful, we can implement it and see it through and get it done quickly without red tape. I think there's a lot of people that probably don't have that luxury where they feel like they might have a lot of momentum taking them in a certain direction or red tape. How do you deal with that if you're in an environment where, there's more bureaucracy, whether you're in a small company or a large company?
Right. Well, that's a tough question. It's a good question. Because while we try and promote people taking charge of their lives, the fact is that there's a lot of things that we're not in charge of.
Yeah.
I think it's awesome that in 3i, you've been able to and been willing to sort of give people more space in which to operate and have some, degrees of ownership and space to work, and I know you do that because you get a better result. Now, it is true that in other situations with other companies that, people might feel that they're in a small box. And so I guess what I would encourage people to think about is think about what it is that you can control. Think about what it is that you can influence, and think about what things that you can mitigate, and everything else, don't spend 1 ounce of energy on it, right? It just is what it is. And then go back to what you can control, which might be simply the quality of every interaction you have with every human being that you meet that day. And then, what are you bringing to the game, right? What's the quality of your thinking? What's the quality of your engagement with people, your listening, your care? You have control over those things. And then I think the other thing I would offer is people can have more influence than they realize. You influence every time you listen, every time you ask a question. Even by the act of your presence. If you're negative and withdrawn, that's contagious. If you're enthusiastic and show that you're interested and you want to be part of the solution, then that's contagious too. And so that's where I really encourage people to go is, go to where you can make a difference. And it turns out that there's always plenty of room there.
Yeah, Reid, you had a lot of stuff that we talked about prior to this around, say, like, this isn't just for people that are managing people or leaders, right? Like, we have a lot of individual contributors, and I think that's John's point is relevant no matter where you sit in an organization.
Yeah, I one of the things just at the very, very top that you hit on was about that change is frightening. And I've always looked at, and you just spoke a little bit about your perspectives and focusing on what you can influence and what you can change. And I think a lot of people do get caught in that rut, and negativity does beget negativity. And so it's easy to do. It's like a human nature just to immediately go to like the most negative thing and just focus on that. But it's such a trap to and it's like almost never ending. It's like a pain cycle. You just can't get out of it. And so I think I wanted to talk a little bit about perspectives, also for the individual contributor, but if you're not managing a team necessarily. But I just wanted to go back a little bit to the perspective thing around change. And even though something could be perceived as a negative, that there is something positive that can come out of it. Something, by definition, you have to have an opposite. You can't have positive without negative, up without down, and so on and so forth. A lot of times we gain definition by something's opposite, or at least we gain the perception of it by its opposite. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit how we can look at something like this that is pretty freaking negative, and really glean a lot of positive out of it. And just before I turn it back over to you, I read a great article in Medium about that. No one's ever been forced, like the whole world has never been forced to just shut down before, right? It never happened. But this is a place where you can now take time to reevaluate what you are doing. And we kind of have like a little bit of a pause button to be able to do that. That time period might be evaporating. That runway could be gone now because of now that we're a little bit into this current working environment. But I would love to explore the ideas around your perspective and how you can make a positive choice to try to find, even in the darkest of situations, a positive light. For people that were furloughed or for people that have lost their jobs, horribly uncomfortable. I know a lot of people that have been in those scenarios. It's not a great experience, but it can force you to find the next path in life, which could be extremely positive, even though it might not feel like it at the time that you're going through it. So can you just talk a little bit about how our perspectives could actually lead to our successes ultimately?
Sure. So change is a disruption in the status quo. And for a lot of people, the status quo is comfortable, known, and positive. And so that a disruption, at least, has an elements of it of taking something away. So the thing is, though, is that a lot of people recognize that that duality that you talked, that the disruption can be a loss and the disruption can be an opportunity. You find that in the Eastern culture, the Chinese symbol for crisis is one of danger and opportunity combined. And you find it in the Western world. We talk about creative destruction, meaning, in the cycle of evolution and innovation and getting better, we're in a sense losing, destroying, dismantling things all the way along. So in fact, the point of change in some ways is, we can't get better without letting go of things that were, comfortable or positive before. And so, that's very much a truth. To make it,
I was gonna say, it's like the chrysalis, like the butterfly. Like you have to transfer in order to become the butterfly. You have to eventually become the butterfly. You can't just be a caterpillar your whole life.
Yeah.
Maybe not the best example, but to your point about change, it's just the first thing that pops in my head that's at least relatable.
Absolutely. This is showing my age a little bit. There was a movie years ago called The Rose it was starred Bette Midler, and it was sort of a fictionalized movie about Janis Joplin. And the song The Rose is all about the fact that, the next step, like the next chapter means you have to close this chapter. There is a mini death as a requirement to the next stage of life. So there's that. But I think to make it maybe a bit more concrete and punchy, I'm going to reference a guy called Jeffrey Gitomer, who probably a lot of salespeople may recognize his name. And he talks about 3 responses to change, right? You can be a whiner, a watcher, or a winner.
That's great. That's great.
Besides the fact it's 3 W's, right? How cool is that? But I think it really gets to it, right? And his point, and I was having a conversation just last week with somebody who was using that framework around something he was seeing and experiencing, like real time, right? If you're in the whiner category, understandable, self-defeating. If you're in the watcher category, understandable, right? Let's see where this is going to go. Ultimately, self-limiting. If you're in a winner category, right, it's a choice, and you vastly increase the probability that you're going to see, your aspirations, come into life. So I think that's, we just need to look around us, and we can sort of see those choices that people are making, and seeing, the results that they get to reap.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the pace of everything is so fast now. If you're not trying to move forward, ultimately you are moving backwards. Like there's no standing still anymore. I don't think it's possible to do for long term, at least, even in the short term, it seems. One of the things that you talked about that that really resonated with me was people first. There's a great book by Gordon Bethune called Worst to First. It's about his takeover when his CEO of Continental Airlines. And Continental Airlines was like one of the worst airlines in the world at one point. It was terrible. But he took it over, and his big thing was like, it was obvious to see what the problem was. It was the people. They were surly to one another. They didn't want to be there. They didn't take pride in their job. There was like a kind of an oligarchy that was created at the VP level and above. The executives took a lot of privilege. And actually, one of the things that happened in the book, there was an executive that was he held up a plane because he was running late, and the plane departed late. And as a result, they got fined. He actually fired the VP. It's not his personal airline, and also to try to show that it's like no one's above like the community, that the greater good is always bigger than all of us, and collectively we are. There's something to be said that the whole of us are bigger than the individual. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about the the loyalty aspect, because I've worked for some really great folks, and I've worked for some really bad ones as well, and I've been on the unfortunate political spectrum of all of that. But can you talk a little bit about why, and just like really hone in on why the people are so incredibly important? I just want to go back to that topic. And just before you do, I want to give an example of actually something that Conor did. We have a happy hour every single day it's like 15 minutes to the end of the day, just to get online and check in with people over a Zoom chat. Sometimes people can't make it. I know I'm very guilty of that, just because of time zones and people that have calls late in the day, so they can't jump on. But it's something that's created a little bit of a culture. And from working from home, I've actually seen more of the individuals working from home than when I was going into the office, just by virtue of the fact that we're that much more connected. And I've told other people about this, and other organizations and other management and other companies have started to implement their own like team work from home happy hours in order to get more connected with their people. And I think it's really easy, especially in crisis mode, to focus so much on what's going wrong. And it goes back to that perspective thing we were talking about, where you can really just kind of refocus on what is going right. And the people of your organization, I think, have a lot to do with that. So can you just talk a little bit more about how to build loyalty and how to treat your people really well, and how you've seen the success stories with that in other organizations?
Sure. Well, what's fascinating is that a lot of us have a split personality around people. I mean, in some ways, people recognize how important people are, and then the very next day, their actions don't seem to match that. They seem to have forgotten that. I don't know. It's inconvenient. And one of the best phrases I ever heard around this was somebody's talking about, when we're recruiting, we put out the red carpet, and as soon as people get hired, it's back to linoleum. And I thought, that's so true. I mean, we just turn ourselves inside out to get talent, and it's all about talent. And then once we got them, it's like, what do we, are we continuing to have our actions match that sense of value? And the answer in some organizations is no, for some reason. So it is super important. And there's some research. There's actually one that I would quote comes from McKinsey, and they did an assessment of, the difference between a top talent and an average talent in terms of their contribution to the organization. And it varies according to the complexity of the job. So for a very low complex sort of entry level job, it's about 25 to 50%, meaning your better performers are going to deliver about 25 to 50% more productivity than an average performer. However, in more complex jobs, it can be up to 800%. So where I'm going with this is, certainly, how we hire is important. However, what I want to say is we can turn top talent into average talent by how we treat people, and we can take, average people and elevate them significantly by how we treat them. And it has a direct impact on how successful the organization is going to be. Now, when we work with people, we try and get people, especially leadership, off the idea of, it's about being nice to people, or it's an ethical thing how you treat people. I mean, if you can go there, but I would start with the idea is it's just damn good business, smart business to treat people how you want to be treated, and treat them with the care and concern and value that that they deserve, because they will richly reward you in how you how you work together and how you operate as a team.
One other thing, so also to talk about leadership, both in teams as well as for the individual contributor, and another great book to call out, which is the 50 Do's of leadership. This is by Mr. John Barrett himself. There's number one and number two are pretty striking because I feel like a lot of times this does not get obeyed in business, and it causes a lot of problems, just in life in general, but it causes a lot of problems. Number one being be consistently 100% honest. And then number two, I also wanted to talk about, because I feel like it's extremely important, being able to build rapport with people, and also just relationships in general, but also to build loyalty. Say I don't know, I'll find out, versus, and then on the bottom here, I also going to know, pretend to be someone you are not. And so can you just go into a little bit about, I mean, I think the honesty thing's, pretty straightforward. If you lie, it would eventually get back to you. That sucks. Don't do that. Don't lie. But the number two thing, I think a lot of times people are always in a place where they have this armor on, where they I have to pretend like I know what I'm doing. And I've always seemed to have more, at least for me personally, I've had way more respect for people when they're like, you know what, I'm not 100% sure, but we'll figure it out, and we can figure it out together, versus somebody who's like, you're like, I don't think you believe the thing you just said. So you talk a little bit about that it's okay to admit that you don't know something, and how that can actually help an organization, because ultimately you can lean on your people to help figure out those problems, which is ultimately why they're there.
So there's a number of words for that, right? There's humility, there's vulnerability, two words that come to mind. And it turns out that, and people are recognizing this, I think, more and more, that the old idea of strength as being like, right and, inflexible and just like, like an iron bar, is just not a good model for leadership. It's not a good model for how we need to work together, etc. And so I think there's three great reasons for what you're describing in terms of, being willing to be vulnerable and to own what you know, what you don't know, what you're good at, what you're not good at, etc. And I think the first one is trust, right? Because, if you're pretending or, putting spin on things, or, doing a marketing job in terms of what you know and what what you're good at, eventually the reality is going to creep up behind you, because people are going to see you in action, and, they're not stupid. And so that's going to undermine your credibility, and it raises the question as to, okay, so what else? Not only what else don't I necessarily believe that this person's saying, but more importantly, do they even know that they don't know, or they're not as good as they think, which is another form of like really sort of undermining a leader's credibility. It's like, is he fibbing to me, and or is he clueless, or she clueless, right? So there's the trust. I think the second thing is that there's nothing more endearing in a leader than a strong, competent leader who has vulnerability, because it's like there's a humanity there that people can connect to, right? And that connection that is priceless. That's where, people end up saying something like, I would run through a brick wall for Conor, which they say all the time, Conor, by the way. I take a bullet for the guy, whatever. I mean, that's I think that speaks to a little bit of that loyalty that you mentioned before, Eric. And I think the last thing I would offer is we made a big deal about adaptability, about learning, and, if you aren't willing to recognize the gaps / misses / opportunities, and how can you possibly learn and grow? Hanging on to, right, the status quo. And so it's a requirement for learning and continuous improvement to, have that openness to the good, the bad, the ugly.
Thank you. Yeah, those are all awesome points. I want to point out one more of these from the 50 do's from leadership, and it's right on the heels of what you were talking about regarding people. This is do number 23. It says focus on the issue and not the person. And then at the end of all these chapters, there's like a do, and then there's like a don't at the very bottom, which is basically the opposite. Don't make conflict personal and emotional. And I've seen this so many times over the last decade plus in my career, where things have gotten very, very personal. And as a result, it goes back to that negativity piece. Negativity begets negativity, and it becomes very cancerous. One of my things I absolutely hated hearing, which is like, I don't even know what that guy does for a living. Like that thing, that is like, I hear that and my blood starts to boil, because it's like, dude, what do you, he doesn't report to you. Like, you're not working with that person all day long. How could you possibly know what they're doing for a living? So the concept that they're not doing anything is completely inane. But can you talk a little bit just about that, about, and it's so difficult to do because, again, human nature, it's like you want to be negative. It's such an easy, lazy thing to do. But can you talk a little bit about, just ways that you can kind of stop yourself and know that you are going down a very bad rabbit hole and not making things personal and giving people a fair shot?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you picked that one, because that really is at the heart of so many successes and or failures. I mean, so a lot of my work working with leaders or teams, etc., is at some point you try to get to the root cause. Right? You dig past the symptoms of, Bill's not talking to Fred, and, Sue's shut down, and, whatever. And you try to get to sort of some of the underlying things that are going on, so that when you move forward, obviously you want things to get better. And this idea of letting things get personal, our egos get involved, right? People get defensive, which can take two forms, right? A good offense is a good defense. So some people get offensive. Some people avoid, and opt out, etc., shut down, and what becomes central to people's work is this conflict, whether it's active or, it's passive. And so the energy and the thinking and the communication is bound up in something that is essentially non-productive. In fact, it's worse than that. It's destructive. And so all that energy that should be going into how do we get better? How do we get smarter? How do we win? How do we adapt? Is getting sucked into this bonfire of vanities. And, and it's just not fun. And people hate going to work, etc. In our second book, we talk a lot about that. And, we talk about this idea of, we can engage with each other. We call it the green path, and make this energy into something that's productive and has synergy and enthusiasm and energy. Or, when we go the dark side, so to speak, we call it the red path. When people start to get their egos involved and they focus on, each other, and the blaming and the shaming and all that stuff, and where that goes. So you're absolutely spot on. It's a big deal, and it takes some effort to turn around, but we can talk about that a little bit more. But it's certainly very important.
I've seen. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Conor. Please.
No, I can certainly. I'll just reflect some of what John said as someone who, I've had like I said in the beginning, I've had the great fortune to work with John for, close to 10 years now. And one of the things that he taught me early on was this concept of green path, red path. And we have woven that into our fabric at 3i. And I think just to share, I can tell everybody finds the model so relatable and so easy to understand. It's like, look, every day we have opportunities, we have challenges, we have problems, and we can take one of two paths with that. We can lean in and engage and seek mutual understanding and focus on the greater good, and that leads to positive outcomes. Or we can avoid, attack, ignore, get defensive, blame, right? And that puts us to the bad zone, and that's the red path. And I think just that whole concept of having a model that's like, okay, green, red, do you lean in? Do you focus on the greater good, or are you going to just pull back and retreat in some form or another, or blame? And when we go over that internally, I think people really get it. They go, oh, okay. And then, in a coaching tool, it's like, hey, that's kind of some Redpath behavior. Oh, that's a really good example of green path.
Mm-hmm.
People get it. So I can just say, like, from an organization that's tried to implement that, it's really effective and it's simple. So I'm something that, I talk about it so regularly, and it's become some shorthand that we use internally. Hey, green path, red path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to make one more point on that, which is, and this, to go back to like the ego piece and the negativity, and it's something that's like, I think it's learned on like the playgrounds when we're a kid, is that you'll try to make yourself bigger by making somebody else look smaller, and it's never the right move, and it's always a temporary fix, and it always just worsens everything. And so I really loved the some of the pieces in this book. Specifically, I want to bring up one more of these. Do number 30. I went through this. It's actually it's an awesome book. There's some really fun quotes in here as well. My favorite one I'm saving for the very end. But do number 30. Face up to issues and deal with them. And so from what you were talking about, and then what Conor just mentioned as well, don't let the mold grow. Just get ahead of it. Be honest, be forthcoming, be vulnerable about it, and just discuss your issues, and do not make them personal, but you have to get ahead of it. So you could talk a little bit about that, about facing up to those issues. And Conor, I'd love to hear your feedback as well,
Yeah.
of some other stuff that you've dealt with before I came on board, and just like how deleterious it is to an organization's whole, so the whole piece of the organization, to just let something go unanswered, untouched, just to let it fester. Can you just discuss that a little bit? Because I have a gazillion personal examples I could talk about. But John, if you want to take that, and then over to you, Conor.
Well, I think where I want to start with that is I'm going to go back to the idea of when we engage with people and we try and get down into, okay, so what needs to change going forward? And part of that is unpacking, some of the recent past, how did we get here? But we try not to dwell on the past because you can't change it. It's all about, what are we going to do different going forward? And invariably what we find, and sometimes when we do this, in a training, we simply ask the question, okay, think of a really tough issue, a really challenging issue, one that got toxic. How, where did it start? And where it started was, it was small and simple and easy. That's where it started, whatever it was. Now, it didn't get tackled. So now it's hard, complex, right? And just like almost, mission impossible. And then just for fun, we'll ask the question, so think of a simple issue that you currently got today, and if you don't deal with that, where that's going to go. And so basically what people discover in retrospect and in thinking is that a lot of times issues don't just go away. There's occasionally things sort of fade and things like that, but I would still offer that there's a remnant there, a seed for the future. And so issues don't go away, and generally, if they're not dealt with, they progress in misunderstanding, and that eventually leads to become personalized, and then it impacts the quality of trust that people have with each other, and so it starts to damage the very integrity, or the the fibers of the team. And so the idea of direct, honest, and respectful, meaning an issue comes up, direct means, directly to the person as quickly as possible, honest, straightforward, and respectful. Just because it's an issue doesn't mean you have license to kill, right? Respectful of the person so you can focus on the issue. And at Humanergy, we've adopted that as what we call the 24-hour rule, which means that, if there's ever an issue or even a question, not even an issue, just call it a question. Like, maybe Conor says something and I'm like, but normally I would just sort of let it go, right? We've adopted a commitment to each other that we will circle back within 24 hours to check in. I say, hey, Conor, When I said something, you made a face, and I just wanted to, but you didn't say anything. I just wanted to make sure, was it because you had spicy food for lunch, or was it something? And, sometimes it's a nothing burger, and sometimes it's the seed of something. And I guess in summary, if we wait until things fester to they become a crisis, it is always difficult. It's always hard, and there's always some sort of scars and damage. And so the secret, preventive, early, good practices going forward, and it keeps it simple, and it really keeps us manageable. That's actually, I mentioned the second book. The subtitle of the second book is, how do ordinary people do the extraordinary? And the answer is, ordinary people do simple things early and often, and it becomes extraordinary, right? That's, as simple as that sounds.
That's why the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or whatever other analogy you want to use. I would just echo what John said. A lot of this stuff are things that, through my time with John, we've implemented, and the 24-hour rule has certainly become shorthand here. I know there's a few folks in our organization that are really big fans, and I'll get a call the next day for something that you just mentioned. Hey, Conor, I got a 24-hour rule thing here. Yesterday we had that meeting and something didn't sit well with me, and I just wanted to circle back on it. And I love those. I love those types of discussions, because it helps me understand, the heart of the issue, what people are thinking, and connect with the people. And you can't read people's minds, vice versa. So I love it when people seek clarity and understanding, and we try to iron out any issues before they are, turn into that point where, like you said, John, you've got scar tissue at the end of it. And I think the other thing that I would just add to that is this concept of a lot of these things that are issues end up not really being that major when you get down to the root of the matter. We found this, and talking with John, we talked a lot about this concept of mutual understanding. And what starts out as this issue on the surface, you think you're over here and the other person's over here, and you leave with that expectation. But in reality, you agree on 80%, and there's a 20% difference. And that's what you're left to figure out. But a lot of times people don't get to that point. They are going in with an agenda and their own biases, and they're not putting themselves in the other person's shoes. So I think with that whole concept of the 24-hour rule, what I found is it usually kind of opens up some space to reflect and think and gain some perspective. And often what you find when you're working through issues is that, wait, we're pretty much in agreement on most of this stuff. It's, small details. Yeah. And it just helps to have those conversations regularly. I'm always thinking like, boy, is this an opportunity to do it better and better and better? But I think that's part of the, one of the things that we're always trying to do too, is just improve and improve and improve. So, all this stuff, you hear it and it sounds so simple. And sometimes the simple stuff is the most effective. So it comes down to execution as well. Like so much in business, it's not who has the best ideas, but who can execute on them reliably. So there's a ton of stuff in there to unpack, and I think lots of really great advice.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to what John had said at the top, which is about, or not, maybe a little lower than the top, but communication, when frequency, up and down, upstream communication is just as important as downstream, and horizontal communication as well, making sure teams are speaking to each other, which brings me to my next one, number 38 on the do's. We won't go through every single one of these in the book, though. It's a fantastic book. I haven't gotten the new one yet, but number 38 is listen and understand first, then act. And then also the don't on that is making snap judgments, which I think dovetails really well into what you guys were just talking about, that how important it is to be able to listen to other people, and especially if there is conflict. But then also a quote in here from Calvin Coolidge: "No man ever listened himself out of a job." So, John, first over to you and then over to Conor. Can you talk a little bit of how important it is to listen, and how that's kind of been a skill that has gone by the wayside over the last few years?
So sometimes, I get into a conversation with somebody and they sort of ask a question, something like, okay, so what's the most important thing? If there's only one thing that I could get better at, what do you think that one thing is? And, it's one of those dangerous questions because there's a lot of one things potentially. And if I had the ability to put one thing into a little bottle and hand it out to people, it would be the ability to listen, because it unlocks so many other things, right? It gives you insights. It expands your thinking. It's the heart of how you really build real, deep relationships of trust, etc. So listening is super important. And what I see in organizations is this amazing phenomenon where the amount of communication is skyrocketed and the amount of understanding has dived. And so you get this bizarre, organizations do these, these surveys. And on one hand, they say, communication sucks around here. And then on the other hand, they say, I'm drowning in emails and voicemails and texts and meetings, I'm triple booked, it's just craziness, etc. So how do we reconcile this idea of volumes up and effectiveness super way down? Okay, so there's a couple of thoughts here. One is, I think we have the wrong definition of communication. So a lot of people, when you ask, what does it mean when you say you communicated, they'll say, you did something, right? You told, you sent, you posted, right? And so they use communication like it's a verb, it's a doing thing. So when we talk with people, the first thing we want to do is we want to blow that up forever and change the definition from a verb to a noun, meaning communication is a result. That's really what you want. And the result is what? It's mutual understanding. And if you tattoo that into your mind that I need to create understanding, and that's my one and only goal, turns out that when you go to do the activity, you're going to do it differently, because you know that just sending the email or whatever it was never going to work anyway. So once you have that definition, number one thing, if you want to guarantee understanding, is you have to what we call close the loop. So, Eric, you tell me something, right? You have a picture in your mind and you try your best to, articulate and explain it. Now, you're an articulate guy, and so you're going to do a very good job. But I listen to those words and I convert that into a picture in my head. Now, you and I have vastly different life experiences. So the assumption that your picture and my picture are going to end up to be the same turns out to be a pretty crappy assumption. And that's what gets us into trouble. So close the loop is simply going, you paint a picture for me, I share back the picture that I got from you, and then we were able to compare the pictures together. And that way we ensure understanding. So that close the loop habit is really, how we break through this idea of doing lots of communication and getting poor understanding. We can talk more about how you send better pictures too, but I'll leave it at that for a moment. And
mutual understanding, not communication, but mutual understanding. Conor, over to you.
Yeah, I would just say, I'll just share something that just came up. I was just thinking this yesterday as we had a leadership, I'll say powwow to figure out something that maybe didn't get, there's a lack of mutual understanding. So we had to react and put a process in place around, something related to how we are developing partnerships and more rapidly than we would normally have. And we put some documentation out there, right? So there's a written document. We had a phone call to go over it. And then here we are, I don't know, 10 days later, where we're all on the phone going, well, I don't understand this. What about this? How about that? What about this? And I'm sitting there thinking, I feel like we talked about all this. Like, I feel like I said this to everybody. How come they're not understanding? And I'm having this thought in my head, like, okay, we didn't close the loop on this properly. There's not a clear mutual understanding. So I didn't have a solution for it yet, but it is probably like a very relevant example, John, for your, like, how do you get that picture? Because that's a struggle, right? You think, okay, hey, I've done a good job. We've had let's say a 30-minute meeting where we've discussed, and then post the meeting, hey, we've got now a written guide. Okay, what? Clearly that didn't do it. I start to think, well, many people, maybe there's some repetition effect that's needed. Okay, that's potentially an option. How is the uptake? How do people learn new process? But that's just you said that, and I immediately went to this thing that was, I just had this call yesterday because we all had to get back together because there's a lot of confusion around this new process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, repetition, they say, you got to say things 7 times before it sinks in. I've heard that phrase before. And there is some truth to that practice, and there's 2 downsides. One, if you're hammering a nail and it's in the wrong spot and you just keep hammer it 7 times, it's just even worse to try and get it out.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So, I mean, if you've already got misunderstanding, doing it another 6 times is probably not going to help. You're just hammering that misunderstanding in there. You're going to have to get stick of dynamite to get it out. Because what happens is we listen with an understanding. So it's like first time we walk away with some sort of understanding. The second time you say it, it's not like I have a blank page. I'm already primed with my bad understanding. So now you're saying more stuff that combines with my wonky understanding. I mean, it's more likely to get worse than to get better, just frankly. And this next thing I would offer is we're adding more noise to the system. Because remember that we had this relationship of more activity, less understanding. Well, in some ways, the answer is not more activity. It's just going to it's going to probably just drive our understanding further down. So we can actually make it worse in that sense as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.
Always sage advice, John.
Well, I can give you 100 examples of my own if you'd like.
Yeah. No, I figured, this is good. It's good. I'm happy to share. I'm happy to, put myself out there and share some of the missteps that we make, and certainly in respect for the greater good, and hope that, hey, somebody listening, watching can learn something. You did say, I want to touch back on the whole communication and collaboration and kind of relate it to the times that we're in right now. And I think this is probably this is very much, when I read your new book that I was fortunate enough to get on the pre-release list for, a lot of that stuff is around collaboration. And I think, boy, what a perfect time for this book, because it's not just stuff that's for leaders, and it's not just, I'll say, concepts that you're left when you read a lot of these business books. It's like, oh, that's an interesting concept, but I don't get it. I don't know what it means. I don't know how to apply it. Reading your most recent book about, how to collaborate really and how to be part of a team. I feel like now that's so important. And the hard thing is, right, it's a different environment. we're all doing this. We're all on video. Everyone's telling us, oh yeah, you got to communicate more. So we're trying to do that, right? And just as you said earlier, communicating more doesn't mean we're being heard or understood. So we're trying, and I'm sure there's a lot of organizations that are trying to do this just like we are. All right, we've got to shift, we've got to react. We're being told we need to shift to video. But just because we're talking doesn't mean we're being heard. Just because we're doing video conferencing now doesn't mean we're being understood. And maybe this is just a recap of some of the stuff you've already said, but anything else you would share on that topic?
Well, a couple of thoughts, and I won't repeat some of the things that I said, but I think I'll try and add a couple of more additional elements. So this ability to create misunderstanding chronically and permeate it through the organization, we were pretty good at doing that even when we were in the same room physically. Yeah. So, we were already in trouble. So now we're moving to this, to the video platform, and that probably adds some additional burden to everybody in terms of creating mutual understanding. And so there's a couple of thoughts there. One is, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the phrase uncanny valley. No?
I'm not.
So it came up when they started to do CGI of people, right? And there's a certain spot where, it's like a cartoon and people can experience the cartoon as like they're real people. But as you push closer and closer to it looking like a real person, there's what's called the uncanny valley where it dips, meaning, and what you see is something that looks almost like a human being, but it's not. It's like it's weird or uncanny or freaky, or it's just off. And that's what they call the uncanny valley. And the reason why I use that phrase is because I think video suffers from the uncanny valley. Meaning, because we turn up and we can see each other, etc., people's mode of engaging with each other is as if we were in the same room. And so they just show up and they just engage their typical thinking and their typical way of interacting, etc., because I can see each other. And it turns out that video is just not the same as we're in the same room together. And so we have to adopt some new and different practices specifically for video that we may not have had to think about if we were in the same room together. So that would be my first offering. And I think now the good news is that there are potentially some advantages to video, particularly with when people start to use like a whiteboard or a common visual space, or we're working on a common visual document, because we talked about having the same picture. So I've seen people in video take advantage of the technology to literally work on the same picture together, and I've seen that to be pretty powerful. So there's an example of using the technology to help. But a couple of quick points is, number one, if you're doing a multi-people video engagement, I would say you're crazy not to have somebody who has nominated as the facilitator / MC. You need somebody paying attention to the process of interaction between people, who's literally watching it and monitoring it and like nudging it, inviting people, backing people off, ensuring close the loop, moving people to some visual document if necessary. I mean, just sort of orchestrating it in some way. And so that's an unusual step for most people. They just sort of turn up and do the Brady Bunch thing right on the screen and off we go. I think the second thing too is close the loop, and like I said, you can do that real time with a common visual summary, so people can not only hear stuff, they can see people's faces around, so it's people to people, but the main event is the issue or the understanding or the problem solving or whatever. I think that's another thing that I would highly recommend as well.
Yeah, I love that.
Just real quick, because I know we're coming to the end of this. I just wanted to circle back one more piece around leadership. So I know we've talked about that a bunch, but I wanted to look at, because the word leadership is a pretty broad umbrella, but I wanted to look at it from also the perspective of the individual contributor, the person that doesn't have direct reports, and how stuff like some of the things I went over in the 50 Do's, as well as some of the other comments that you guys have made. What can you talk about? What can you speak to that would resonate with those individual contributors that ultimately need to be their own boss? They need to be their own leader. How can you, or what are some of the things that you can talk to about, like from this book, from your second book, and the book coming out, that will really resonate with those individuals?
Sure. So we believe and promote that everyone can be a leader, that everybody has that ability as well as that opportunity. And because we separated the idea of leader meaning a specific designated role, right? I am team leader. I am, supply chain leader as a designated role, to a more fundamental idea of, are you influencing, right, a group of people towards a common purpose in a productive and constructive way, right? So if you take that type of definition, which is sort of more fundamental, then, and you look at your opportunities throughout the day, you have many, many choices that you can make that can influence an interaction with another human being to a common goal, a common purpose in a productive and constructive manner, right? And so it's really, and that starts with, as an individual contributor, which is, as you mentioned, Eric, individual contributor, all day you're engaging with people in some level of, collaboration, right? Or you're working for a common purpose. And, how you engage with that person, how you're able to influence them to the, for whatever that greater good is, those are all elements of leadership. So if you find yourself taking a backseat, if you find yourself just going along, if you find yourself opting out, if you find yourself avoiding, if you find yourself going whatever, whether you say that aloud or just inside your mind, if you find yourself rolling your eyes, if you find yourself reacting to somebody in kind, those are all examples of you not taking the opportunity for leadership. So, flip them, right? Somebody says something negative, you respond with a, in a positive, constructive manner. Something's happening, and you can sort of see it going potentially in a risky direction. You ask the question, right? I mean, there's lots of small ways that we can exert influence over our own destiny, but also, the common purpose that we all share. And I would call all those things leadership. And I'd encourage anybody to look around them, because they happen, many times every hour, and then you go home, you're a dad, you're a mum, you're a brother, you're a sister, you're a daughter, you're a member at a church or whatever. I mean, they're just all parts of our life have a social element in which we can help things, be better, and we can make a difference.
We were talking before I even started 3i, and I think I'm just telling you at the time that, I'm considering starting this company, and this is the idea, and I've got some apprehension, and I'm sort of fixated on this worst case scenario, right? Like, what are the worst possible things that could happen if I do this, right? Like, I lose my house, my car, my job, my marriage dissolves, like all of those things, right? And I'm kind of just unpacking that in front of you, and you're like, hey, you're talking about the worst case. Like, why don't we refocus the lens on maybe most likely, most probable bad case, and try to think in terms of that versus going to the absolute worst case. And that's always stuck with me, and something that, I mean, I use that filter all the time to try to catch myself in terms of decision making. Am I going to worst case scenario? Oh, okay, pause. And you know, with other people in the organization. Because the probability of the worst case scenario coming true, right, is highly unlikely. So we got to think maybe in sort of different terms to help our decision making. And I think now, right, this time is a great example, because I'm sure a lot of us are immediately going to that worst case model. So I wanted to maybe throw that back at you, because I think you've got a ton of wisdom around that space, and if you want to add something to that.
Sure. So the idea of thinking, okay, what's the worst possible is not an uncommon tool that people use, whether they're thinking about, organizational strategy, or even just, what do I get for dinner tonight or whatever, anything in between. And what I've seen, having tried to facilitate literally thousands of people, that worst possible just derails the group or the individual in ways that it's hard to recover from. And the reason is we go there and we spend time there, and what happens is we identify these things, and because we spent time there, we've inflated the probability that they could occur, which then leads us to either over designing what we were going to do, or just basically throwing our hands up and saying, well, why bother? It's too hard, it's too big. Quite often the worst possible are things that we have almost zero control over anyway. And, it's like, okay, well, I don't know what we're going to do about that. And human beings naturally aren't good statisticians. So, for example, if I ask you, what's the worst possible? And you sort of say, a meteor is going to come from the sky and, it's going to obliterate life as we know it. I say, wow, that's a true statement. It's happened before.
Yes.
And it's going to happen again. Absolutely. And then if I said, okay, well, let's just put that back in context. What's the probability of that? Honestly, all of us can't really do a good job of thinking about, especially low probabilities, and that we've already sort of activated that in our mind, and we can't scale it back again. So what I have found is, to your point, is ask not so much what's the worst possible, what's the worst probable. And it just takes people to a place where they're going to get, it's going to be in a better perspective. It's going to be more realistic. It's going to be more manageable. It's more in control. And that leads to, better problem solving and ultimately better solutions. So, I use it all the time, personally and professionally. And it's one of those things that just breaks through, if you like. Yeah.
Can you, so in it sort of to dovetail into that as an additional thing, I feel like to break yourself out of those types of habits, it's a great deal of self-awareness that has to go into those types of things, to know when you're self-sabotaging, and also to talk a little bit about a person's emotional quotient and how you can pick up to know when you're being both self-negative, but when you're also you can perceive another person's negativity, or in the case of them being positive, or knowing when they're like a little off. Can you talk a little bit about how to develop like your EQ? Because it's so incredibly important. I feel like it gets overlooked a lot, and it takes a little bit of like I don't know if it's like meditation or just a forcible consciousness to be able to not focus on yourself and to really absorb the world around you. I feel like some people are just naturally better at it than others. My brother is incredibly good at it. My father and both my mother as well was incredibly good at that. I don't know how they developed that skill. It just seemed like they just have it. But can you talk a little bit about a person's like self-awareness and their emotional quotient and how maybe they can develop that into something that can help literally identify all the stuff that we talked about and, control that negativity and really be a positive force in nature in the world around them?
Yeah. So EQ, emotional quotient, or sometimes called EI, emotional intelligence, it turns out the research shows that that's the difference maker. You can have the traditional intelligence that gets you to a certain threshold. You can have a technical competence that you've developed through experience and study, etc. But in terms of success in modern life, particularly in organizations, whether it's a leader at whatever level, team, whatever, EQ is the one that sort of separates out, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so just to emphasize how important that is. The other thing is that our EQ is not just limited to our emotional social life. It turns out that getting a handle on our biases and our emotional state is a requirement for getting clarity in our intelligence. Right? So I work with lots and lots of smart people, and honestly, the work is essentially getting them to identify and either neutralize, mitigate for their emotional state and or ego state and or cognitive biases, meaning they're getting in their own way. So that's really just to emphasize that. Now your question was, how do we get better at that? And so I wrote down sort of 3 ways. One way is if you find yourself, you're probably going to say, okay, I'm stuck somehow. I don't know why, but don't feel like I'm moving forward. So what I would say is the best way to do that is write down what it is that you're thinking. Right? Just write it down in black and white. I'm thinking the world's going to end. This is never going to happen. Whatever. I mean, and if you're having trouble thinking that, imagine yourself talking to somebody else, a trusted friend. What would you say, and write it down and don't edit it. That's important. You just got to write it down. Then step away from it and come back and then read it and what that does is the step away and come back allows you to sort of see it with a more objective viewpoint. Because when you're in it, that's where it's really difficult. So you got to sort of see it from the outside, because when you see it from the outside, you're going to recognize it for the crazy that it might be. Because you literally read it and, oh my God, that doesn't make sense. That's not true. That's not logical. That's not factual. That's not me. That's not even something whatever, right? And then, so once you've done that, then the next step is to rewrite, right? Right. So, everybody hates me. Might be, an operating bias that you're feeling sorry for yourself, right? You can't go away. You come back and you read it. You're like, yeah, that's not even true. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that, but that's not true. So you rewrite it. How would you rewrite that? It might be, my wife's frustrated with me at the moment because I've been working too much, and my kids are teenagers. That's more the truth, right? Well, once you've got your new rewrite, then you're probably in a good place to go forth and be better. Now, the point of it is twofold. One, you're going to get immediate better result from that exercise. But 2, you're training the muscle. So you're doing it mechanically, right, for a little bit. But just like riding a bike, when you start off, it's all mechanical. But after a while, you jump on and off you go.
Just kind of happens. Yeah.
Exactly. So now the other ways of doing it is you can do it with a partner or with somebody else and say, okay, so, Reid, you were in the meeting, what did you see? What did you hear? And so because again, the point is whether you do it by writing it down or you get somebody else involved, a colleague or a coach or whatever, you're looking for that outside in, because it's the outside in that is the secret here. It's the inside out that's got you in trouble.
It's an interesting, the outside in.
We could probably go on this topic for
a
long time.
I was just going to say, I feel like we should do another follow-up just about developing your EQ, because this is it's a pretty bold and very large. Yeah, I think it's really, I think it's a really important topic, though. We are coming to the end of our time, so I just wanted to open up real quick to closing comments. I know you guys talked about there's a ton of gems in here. This book, again, I just wanted to, I know it's not your latest, but it is a fantastic book, The 50 Do's for Everyday Leadership. Practical lessons learned the hard way, so you don't have to. It's a great thing. You can learn from your own mistakes. You should, but if you can learn from somebody else, it's a fantastic trait to boast. So, Conor, I'll just turn over to you for your closing comments, and then John, over to you, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just want to thank John for joining us today. It's always a pleasure. You're one of my favorite people to talk to, probably because you are, like I said in the beginning, right, someone who listens incredibly well. And I think just to share, an example of that, we're on this call before we start recording, and we're talking about the intro, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to set that up. And Reid and I are talking, and I probably talk for 3 minutes. And then John's like, oh, let me feed that back at you in a very concise sound bite, right? So that ability to listen, understand, and reflect, I always enjoy that. So thank you. And then John, I would love for you to plug your new book. And then if anyone's interested in learning more about you or Humanergy, where can they find you?
Okay, great. So here is the brand new book. This is, I would say, hot off the presses. So what great teams do great. And as I mentioned, the tagline, how ordinary people accomplish the extraordinary. And like the first book that Reid mentioned, this comes directly from our work in the field. And so we're not academics. We work with people, help them solve their problems, and, build the capabilities. And, as we do that, we obviously learn a lot from people. We learn from their experiences. We also learn from their own wisdom. And we're super sponges. We pull it together and try and bring it into a form that really is simple and approachable and practical, accessible, and that people can use. And so that was our intent. So this book is now available from all good bookstores. So, you can do the Amazon thing, you can do the Barnes & Noble, but then your local bookstore can order it for you. So if you'd like to support your local economy, that's an awesome choice as well. Mm-hmm. And you can find out more about me and also my organization at humanergy.com. That's Humanergy. Humanergy.com.
All right, thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, this has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you for making time for this, and thank you also for everyone listening or anybody watching for tuning in. I hope you guys learned something. I know I did. I always do when I'm with you guys. And check us out for the next episode of Beyond the Device, where we'll be talking about EQ with John. We're committing him to it right now. Anyway,
this is a blast.
Absolutely. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. We'll see you on the internet. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.